opinions.
What's the channel, by the way?
Yeah, what is the channel?
We're on it right now. It's called Magnum Opi.
Okay. Oh yeah, the podcast.
I just want to make sure I can find it on the,
This is a good way of shilling our own channel whilst we're broadcasting live.
Exactly. It's good to test how easy it is to get to your own channel.
Okay, so let's do some introductions. So I'm the Albion. We are the Magnum Opi podcast. We've basically come together. We're going to be looking at a different book every few weeks or so, just to analyze it, pull out some interesting themes, and try and bring the best of arts that there are to you. I'll go through the list of guests that I have with me, and if you can just introduce yourself, and just to make it interesting, when I go through, give me what your desert island book would be. So if we start with Quack House. You're currently muted.
Yeah, sorry. So hiya, and I don't know, desert island book. The first one that comes to mind, I don't know, Day of the Triffids, maybe.
Do you want to elaborate or just leave it at that?
I haven't really thought about it. I'll have to get back to you.
Okay, next up we got Brandy.
Good morning from U.S. States. My favorite desert island book would probably How to Build a Raft that is seaworthy, based upon materials you can find on any desert island in 3 easy steps.
I was waiting. I knew someone was coming up with an answer like that.
What about Robinson Crusoe?
What about Lord of the Flies? Okay, next up.
If I actually had to stay there, I'd probably be the Encyclopedia Britannica. Pick your edition.
Just so you have enough material to keep yourself warm. You got plenty of fuel for the fire. Okay, next up we have got Mr. Lizard.
Yeah, hello everyone. Greetings from the Netherlands. And as to the book, I don't know. You kind of sprung this on me a bit. I don't know. I'm kind of siding with Brendy with just going for a survival book, but I also kind of doubt my ability, so maybe I should just go for some Bible or something and just pray my way to damnation.
That was my first thought as well, the Bible.
Yeah, no, that's a good shout.
And if we're going for a practical aspect, I would take the SAS Survival Guide.
I think this is not in the spirit of the question.
No.
You're not supposed to come up with a cheaty way to get off the island. You're supposed to tell us what story you could read over and over again.
Blake, as you put everyone in their place, why don't you give me what your book would be?
It's funny actually. I would go for the Bible as well, which is anyone that actually knows me would be quite shocked. But I've just been reading the Bible for like the first time recently, and
what
there's
edition?
a lot. It's actually the New Living Testament or something. It's basically a modern language version of the Bible. And so I only got hold of it because it's just made it quicker to read because it's just in like modern English. It's like cheating a little bit, but I just have to say, because there's so much in it. Like there's so many different stories and like there's really crazy stuff in there. I love it.
You sound surprised that there's a lot to read in the Bible.
No, that's not what surprised me. What surprised me is that I found it so there's just so much diversity of story to choose from. I'm sure you could just keep picking it up and going back to like different parts of it. There's really something for everyone in there.
Different genres, poetry.
Yeah. And lastly, Freelance Bishop.
Hi, I'm also from the Netherlands, but I'm not related to Mr. Lizard. My favorite book would be The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, to take along.
That's a good choice.
Thank you.
Okay.
Solid.
Right, so the first book that we're going to be looking at this episode is going to be, as you can see, Frankenstein. Pop over. These are my editions here. I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with the Penguins edition. I think that's probably the most common. I think a couple of people were listening to the audiobooks of it. How did you find those?
Yeah, it was. Mine was just a random one I found on YouTube, and I'm not really sure which version it was or anything. It was just it was
Who?
Livervox. It was a Livervox recording.
I was just going to ask who voiced it. Was it anyone interesting?
I don't know. No, I think it was more than one person as well. And there were certain bits where I felt like they'd either messed up or done something and then like injected something else, because it would randomly, the voice would subtly change all of a sudden and then come back again. But on the whole, it was pretty unnoticeable. But and they tried to put on a voice for the.
That's
monster.
always the issue. I can't imagine they either go too theatrical with it and have lightning effects in the background and
well, like no, because the first one I clicked on was a bit like that, and I immediately turned it off as soon as I realised there were sound effects. But the other one, it was all right. It was just as soon as it was monster, it went a bit like, oh yes, that kind of
feature.
Okay, so let's start off with having a brief summary of the story. Does anyone want to step up and kind of give us a brief overview of it for anyone that hasn't read it?
How long do you want the summary to be?
A couple of sentences.
Okay. There's this Swiss young man. He starts narrating about how he grew up and how he went to study in Ingolstadt. And he's really interested in alchemy and in natural sciences, given that this is the early or the end of the 18th century. Galvanism, nowadays known as electricity, was quite new, and he decides to combine this with alchemy to discover the secrets of life. So he creates a being, a creature, and this creature kind of, after he's done this kind of freaks him out. And the creature then goes on a rampage, killing Frankenstein's younger brother. Then he meets the creature, who tells his whole story, how he came up to that point. More murder ensues after they go to Scotland for some reason, and then they flee into Russia, into the snow, and to the North Pole.
If for some reason he's supposed to make the female version in Scotland, right? I don't know if there's any.
The reason that's given in the book is that he needs information from English scientists. That's why he goes to Britain.
That's why he goes to Scotland.
And then he goes to Scotland.
Yeah. Well, in Edinburgh, there was a lot of experimentation with bodies at the time. Although I don't think there's any, from what I can remember, there's no actual mention in the book of how he gets the body parts for the female monster.
He gets some, all right, for the female, no.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's pretty succinct cover of basic summary. So what we wanted to do is, before we dive into the actual text, we're going to take a look at the author and the surrounding environment and see kind of how it came about. So it was written by Mary Shelley. It was published in 1818. I think, does anyone want to do any kind of background knowledge on what they know about Mary Shelley? I've done a bit of a deep dive, but does anyone want to take the reins on it?
I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, so Mary Shelley was the daughter of two radical kind of leftists, basically, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. It's Mary, right? And,
yes, yeah.
And who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So she's an early feminist. And she fell in love with the poet Shelley. He was married at the time. They ran off together. They went to the continent, and I think the conditions of the story, I think this is on a separate trip, right? Where they, with Lord Byron, they had a ghost story competition, and this was her contribution.
Yeah, so the way it kind of came about, they went on a trip. It was her, Percy Shelley, her sister-in-law, stepsister, Claire, and Byron, who was having an affair with Claire. And it was summer of 1816, later known as the year without summer, because I think it was a volcanic eruption that basically caused massive disturbances throughout the world in terms of the climate. So they would basically stuck in for the entirety of the summer. They had a ghost reading competition, and in a dream, so she says, she had a vision of what would later become Frankenstein's monster, basically. So just on her, I know you touched on her parents already. We will move on to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, her mother was an early feminist. Her father was also a massive political figure in terms of his writing. He was an anarchist. He was heavily involved with. Her mother was heavily involved in the French Revolution, and actually was in France with Thomas Paine at the time the revolution was happening. So it kind of gives you an idea of where Mary Shelley's mindset was, especially when you look at the two gentlemen that she was away with. Obviously, we've got Percy Shelley. He was, again, a romantic author, and was heavily involved in some of his literature was used for promotion of revolution, not the French Revolution, but later on with figures like Gandhi. It was all used to promote quote unquote peaceful protests. And then Byron similarly again. Yeah, does anyone else have any other comments they want to make on anyone that we're looking at here?
I just wanted to say that I don't think you mentioned that both her parents were vigorously anti-marriage right until they married each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. I opined the other day that in a way it was a big irony that Shelley, who was a great admirer of Godwin, he took this sort of attack on marriage very seriously, and when he ran off with Godwin's daughter, Mary Shelley, Godwin was actually horrified, and he never wanted to speak to them again. So it was kind of a weird. You could say that he created a Frankenstein's monster of a kind in Shelley in this.
Yeah, that's definitely certainly a way that I look at it. Is that Shelley might actually identify with, out of the lot of them, most with the monster, because as you say, her parents were right on being against marriage right until the moment they get married, and he tries to deconstruct the traditional family up until the moment his daughter tries to run away with a married man, and then he basically disowns her. So it's not uncommon for these types of writers to have radical opinions unless it occurs in their backyard.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about this was how pronounced all of these influences were throughout the book. So there's a lot of things in the book about the way people interact and families are structured that echo elements of this unique family structure.
Yes, and I think one of the biggest parts of the book for the monster or the being is his idolization of the ideal family that we get with De Lacy. And again, I do wonder if that is coming directly from Mary Shelley of her seeing this normal family, living a normal family life, and kind of idolizing what she could have had. Who knows?
On the outside,
yeah,
looking
exactly. So that's her parents. Oh, you carry on.
I was going to say most of the families in it, they're all very positive, aren't they? They're all very close, and they're all kind and
even facing the greatest adversity, they're still being nice to each other and ideal. And despite the fact that they went from being rich to very poor or relatively poor, there's no stress and everything is okay, and they're still happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even in Frankenstein's family as well, and also the worse it gets in all their cases, like it makes them stronger and closer rather than
Yeah, even
pushing them apart or making
the
it
death
worse.
of William, the execution of Justine.
Yeah, there's no
Yeah.
amount of pressure that's put on any family unit in the book that makes them come apart. It always is there to enforce them coming together, which again is, well, do you disagree?
The last, and then we should probably touch this when we get to it, but the very last part with respect to Frankenstein's father's reaction to the final straw
Right. Okay.
was complete collapse. But
yeah, well, unless anyone else has anything that they want to touch on
Yeah.
for the actual influences, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say about like her partner was a writer or something. I don't know exactly what, but there's some question about as one of the listeners just pointed out, one of the viewers, the book was attributed to her husband initially until he declared it wasn't him. And there's some question about like what level of involvement he had in it. Was he kind of co-writing it or?
Yeah, we're never going to know the answer to that.
No,
really.
Obviously, it's just a sort of question mark. It's just a sort of interesting point.
Yeah, I would say whatever the answer to that, whether or not he directly wrote it or not, there's definitely his influence on it.
Yeah.
And of course, if it did turn out that he wrote it, that would be suppressed nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see a headline coming out. Famous female author discredited.
Yeah.
I mean, we
also,
did say it'd be worth. I just want to say, comparing it to her other work, just to see, how it differs in style.
There's extensive quotations of romantic poets, including Shelley.
Yeah. So again, I mean, this term is overused, but I'm going to use it here anyway. The book is almost a Frankenstein of quotes from other script, like other texts, whether it be Paradise Lost or Shelley's poetry. A lot of it is assembled through other texts being thrown together. It's really difficult to know. Like I say, whatever the actual situation was, he had a lasting influence on the book. Whether or not he directly wrote it with her or not, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing to mention is the age in which they met. I think it's just something that's worth bringing up. And his wife. So Percy Shelley came across Mary when she was, I believe, 15 and he was 19, 20, somewhere around there. And then they eloped shortly after that. And it was not long after where Percy's wife then commits suicide.
She was pregnant.
Conveniently
Yes.
committed suicide so they could
Yes.
then marry.
The wife was pregnant.
Yes.
When she ran off, anyway. I don't know if the baby died or not. But
Yeah, it's a real soap opera of events. I know that there is a film.
Family is just like the whole thing is a bit like all the connections between them. Percy Shelley being like almost an apprentice of her father, and being obsessed with him, and then marrying his daughter, and it's just all a bit weird.
Yeah, I know that there recently was a film made where I think it was Ellie Fanning playing Mary Shelley, which I would definitely I want to watch that at some stage just to see how well they actually portray just how crazy the interrelations between everyone were. Right, so does anyone else have any other comments on the influences before we move on to next slide?
probably Byron hopping in and out of everyone's beds all the time as well.
Yes.
Mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
And some sort of question of like orgy stuff going on at these Byron. Byron. I don't know if that's real or not, but
I mean, from what we know about Byron, I'd be very surprised if they weren't just these complete hedonistic, like 120 Days of Sodom-esque orgies. Right. Okay. So moving on from the people that influenced her, let's go on to the text that influenced her. So the two that we've got here, we've got a sculpture, obviously, of Prometheus, and next to it we have Paradise Lost. So the subtitle of Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus. Obviously, it's quite obvious the influence there. We could talk quite a bit about the parallels of Prometheus. Does anyone want to take the reins on it? Because there's a lot we could dive into. We could spend an entire episode looking at Prometheus himself. But,
Prometheus was the titan who created humans, according to the Greeks. And he fashioned them from clay and gave them a divine spark, a certain warmth, which is also referenced in the book, that you need like this heat of life inside of a being in order to be alive.
Is it Hesiod? Did you say?
Sorry?
Is it in Hesiod?
No, a certain heat.
Oh,
warmth.
I thought perhaps that it was Hesiod who has this account of Prometheus.
So and then afterwards, Prometheus saw humanity and stole fire to give it to them, and then he was punished for that famously. But yeah, actually, the reference I think is more to the fact that he created humans, that he created life, and Victor Frankenstein does the same. And then, so in that respect, he is the modern Prometheus, and he's also kind of punished for his act.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's both. He created life, and also he goes beyond the proper limits.
Yeah, it's a combination of being the creator, but also there's the element of hubris, which is a running theme throughout it. Getting far too big for your boots, and it's strange because actually with the Promethean story, it's the creator who. The contrast between Paradise Lost and Prometheus when it comes to the influences is that the creator is who suffers in Prometheus, but in Paradise Lost, it's obviously the created. It's Lucifer who is the one that goes through the struggle. So it's an interesting contrast between those two.
Dr. Frankenstein starts to be punished as soon as his creature opens his eye. He thinks he's beautiful up until that moment. He's assembled him from what he thinks are beautiful parts, and he expects to have a beautiful creature. And then as soon as it opens its eye, he's horrified and he starts suffering.
Yeah, well, he just before he animates him, it's quite it's almost like a bit homoerotic, isn't it? The way he describes him, and then the second he's animated and he starts to jerk about, and he's immediately horrified.
I wondered whether it was that he was deluding himself before he animated him, or that he was kind of going crazy the moment he did. Like if either account is real.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you've been working on something for so long, you're going to kind of build it up in your mind, aren't you? And you've got all these ideas, and it's all like you're snapped out of reality when the thing actually takes a life of its own.
It's like building a super weapon, like an atomic bomb, and then when you see it going off, you realize what you actually built. And up to that point, you're so focused on details that you don't see the bigger picture.
Well, the translation from theory into reality is always a brutal contrast.
Yes.
You're saying that Frankenstein is basically like Oppenheimer, or his what is it? I am become death kind of quote.
I become death, the destroyer of worlds.
There's some parallel there that you see what you have created, because when you were working on the atomic bomb, or maybe when Frankenstein was working on the creature, you're so engrossed in the details that you don't actually see what you're building. So he kind of also writes it in the book that okay, you have all these parts and they look beautiful, but then he looks to the complete assembly, and then he's horrified by it because he finally takes a step back and realizes what he built. And
yeah, and I think it's also this kind of hint of it's not because it's a being of not quite nature. It's like an aberration on nature itself. It's almost like an affront to the soul. Is his being. I don't think. To be honest, I don't think in the book she does enough justice to this aspect of it. I think it could have been gone into a little bit more detail and described a bit more, because it's probably one of the most for the monster. It's one of the biggest aspects is the fact that he is his own creator. It hates him. That is covered in the book, but I think the reason why is not really explored that much.
Well, I mean, if we look in the Bible, for example, when God resurrects Lazarus, when Jesus resurrects, it's glorious, right?
Mhm.
But when, you know, in this context, in this unnatural way, it's hideous. And this is this sort of unintended consequences. This is the essence of horror, I would say.
Yeah. No, I agree, and it's also the unknown. But we'll kind of get into that shortly.
Well,
So,
it's the introduction of the unknown into the known.
yeah. Okay, so that's a lot of that is kind of covered. Prometheus. Do we have anything else on Paradise Lost that we want to mention? Nope.
It was a great prequel of Paradise Regained.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Again, with that one, it's the story is all about. It's basically the creation and the fall of humanity retold through epic poem.
And it's one of the books that the creature reads, I think. Right?
Yeah. So it's one of the three books that he later finds, and it's kind of described that he doesn't really have a concept. He being the creature doesn't really have a concept of fiction. So when he's reading it, he is really taking on board the situation and finding himself relate only to Satan. So the big thing I want to touch on with Paradise Lost is its influence and the way it was reinterpreted throughout this time, where you had the Romantic movement come along.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of span it on its head, where it was always written so that Satan was an empathetic character,
mm-hmm.
but they started really emphasizing Satan as being the protagonist of the story, and basically making him as a hero as opposed to someone that's just can be empathized with. And it's also this rejection of the ultimate good and kind of this this heroic this will that it's not the heroic will, but this will that Satan has to fight against his, quote unquote oppressor. That kind of moves away from the Romantic into like the Marxist reading of it, but that was also becoming quite prominent as well.
Well, it made perfect sense for Milton to show Lucifer's attractive qualities, because I mean, sin is attractive after all.
Yes, yeah. There's actually, I've got a quote from Blake I found quite interesting. He said, "The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and any of the devil's party without knowing it." So it's basically, as you say, sin is one of the most attractive elements of the story. So it's easy to sympathize with him, but it doesn't mean that he should be viewed as anything more than he is.
Right.
Okay. Let's move on. Oh, there was another interesting thing that I found. God is quite often referred to in Paradise Lost as the victor, which obviously our main character is Victor Frankenstein.
Well,
and Percy Shelley quite often used the name Victor as his pen name when he wanted to write anonymously.
Which adds to the whole he is Frankenstein thing.
Yeah. There's a lot of little nuggets everywhere of the interconnectivity of everything. Let's move on to one of the more obvious ones. So I just want to take a look at where it's kind of led to. So we've covered some of the lofty themes that we have when discussing Frankenstein the book, but where it's actually got us, I think the change from the book to what we know it as now probably mainly occurred. Most people will probably think of the Boris Karloff Universal picture Frankenstein as the big change, and that definitely did help it. But I think the image of Frankenstein was also being used in quite a lot of propaganda. I haven't got an image of it there, but there was it was being used a lot in kind of in cartoons. A lot of illustrators were making use of a Frankenstein's monster to personify, I think the Irish was a big one, but that's kind of where we end up with. It's just this lumbering monster. Does anyone want to go through the list that we've got here? The bottom left, I'm curious if people know what that's in reference to.
Yeah. Well, I don't know why he's Frankenstein's monster, but I know who that is.
Yeah, so it's Edgar Winter. They've got a song called Frankenstein.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's the way it came about. It's made by them throwing together some of the music that they had left over from recordings and kind of making a song, making a Frankenstein's monster of it. That's the other thing. In obviously general language, it's used as a prefix, like Frankenfood. They've got Frankenberry. I think the most interesting legacy that it leaves behind in the bottom right is how it kind of goes from the Gothic to the sci-fi. Does anyone want to touch on that? I know that we've got a couple of people that are really big fans of Blade Runner.
Well, if you talk about Frankenstein itself as a book, it could be viewed as one of the first science fiction books, because it deals with the implications of science goes wrong, for example, which, like, okay, if we take this scientific discovery and just keep extrapolating, where do we end up? And in this case, we end up with a creature which is which wreaks a lot of havoc. We also see this in a movie like Blade Runner, where we have and what are called replicants, and these are basically humanoid replications, so they're grown in a lab, and while they're not as abhorrent as a creature of Frankenstein, they do tend to go on a rampage after a while because of psychological problems, and this is why they were given a 4-year lifespan, and the whole movie, the antagonist's reason to do stuff is because he wants to have more life. And that's why this picture we have on the bottom with Roy Batty and what's him called, Tyrell. He's asking his maker if he could extend his life, which his maker cannot. So he ultimately ends up killing his maker. And you see something similar in the movie Ex Machina, where you have this android, this artificial life form, which he puts on pieces of skin, which makes her look human. And
Falls in love with it.
Yeah, well, the question is if she's actually she's faking a lot. At least that's what the impression I got from the movie, and that has a lot of parallels with the book. That she's really intelligent and well spoken, but in the end she's malevolent. So she ends up. I think she basically kills everybody and then escapes. So sorry for spoilers for people who haven't seen it yet.
Anyway.
But yeah, she did it basically. It's an artificial created being which goes on a rampage, and both of these science fiction movies have this as a theme.
Yeah, I think it's a natural progression from, as you say, it's the first science fiction. Some people call it the first science fiction novel, if not one of the first, and it kind of takes a natural progression from the, galvanist electricity ways of creating life to going into a modern era, replicants and androids and things like that. I think it's quite an easy route that you can see that it takes. I
mean, maybe an even more interesting aspect of this is that it's not so much the science itself, but also the motivation behind it. Because Frankenstein, the doctor, at multiple times had these very grand ambitions and this great talk about the future of humanity and how he was going to add this much to human legacy and stuff.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think
in his motivations.
Yeah, there's a running theme starting with Frankenstein of creators not being good enough to create life, basically, and the effects that it has on their creations. That's definitely quite a running theme that we see in sci-fi now with any kind of android.
Yeah, they're
flawed creators
because of them.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone else have anything else they want to touch on when it comes to Frankenstein and pop culture?
Maybe
Young Frankenstein.
Yeah, well, before you start on that one, I just wanted to say, just in general, just the perception I had of Frankenstein from all the kind of, not just the movies, but he's inserted into a lot of other fiction as a sort of side character and things. But the book is very different to to most of that. It
Yeah,
tells a very different story.
You imagine him as slow and lumbering in
Yeah.
most things. You know, it's like strong, but very slow and just a bit dull. Whereas he's
inarticulate.
the opposite.
Inarticulate. Whereas in the book, he's incredibly articulate, or he becomes so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's ridiculously intelligent.
Yeah.
The pop culture transition has really removed much of the subtlety or point of the character.
Yeah.
So
He's like a zombie.
he's been stripped of anything that actually identified him as a character with depth and made into a one-dimensional standout or pop-up without any subtlety or complexity or redeeming qualities.
Well, he's basically interchangeable with any other monster that you might come up with now. At least with people like the modern version of people like Dracula, at least he is a vampire. There's something to him. Whereas the modern Frankenstein now, I don't even know why they bother using him, because there's nothing apart from the being tall and lumbering and groaning.
Well, he's the classic implacable, or rather unstoppable force. The unbridled death that is eventually going to come for all men.
I don't know. I would have said in most things he's pretty useless. Like, I can't really think of anything that they use his image in where he's strong or particularly strong or fast or clever or anything. It's usually just there for some kind of comedy value or that kind of thing.
In the book, he's a kind of Superman, really, isn't he? I mean, he can run faster. He's taller. He's at some point he's beautiful.
I mean, if it wasn't for the fact he's ugly, he'd do very well.
On Less Than Man.
Oh, hang on a minute. Well, what was that, Brandon?
I was just suggesting that he's capable of surviving where man can't, and on food that can't support man.
Yeah, there's constant references to him being able to survive in the climates that would kill normal man.
He said he could basically just live off acorns at one point.
Yeah.
That's all he needed.
Yeah, and I think that may have been done as a way of him being portrayed as even less or even more inoffensive. He is this, if he was accepted into society, he is this, inoffensive, doesn't need much caring. He doesn't even need to eat animals, so he can just live off of what's found on the floor, basically. So it kind of adds to that social cruelty element where it's only because he's being rejected by society that he can't integrate. But if he could, then he's maybe I'm misreading that, but that's the kind of interpretation I get, that he's this sweet innocent little thing that just wants to be loved.
Was there a kind of vegetarian superiority idea at the time it was written? There's that kind of
perpetuated
kind of thing,
perpetuated by Percy Shelley. So that's another little nod of their relation. Percy Shelley was famously a vegetarian as well.
That's interesting. I think the setting plays a huge role in the delineation of the monster, because it's the setting which is sometimes described as heavenly, but another, sublime, but also gloomy, but incredibly challenging, right? And it kind of shows how he can survive in these incredibly challenging climates, right?
Do we want to go into Young Frankenstein at all? I've only just watched it today, so we can cover a little bit if you want.
Well, I found it as one of the most, and this really surprised me, most accurate retellings of the story. At least the first couple acts of the film, because there was quotes lifted directly from the book. There were, relationships between the characters that seemed to be lifted from the books. And the final Frankensteinian monster culmination was also an accurate reflection of what was supposed to be in the book. So the evolution of the monster to what the character was reflected in the book is something that really I haven't seen repeated in popular culture or remakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy to think that it's one of the most accurate portrayals. I mean, and it's not spot on to the book, but it is one of the closest you can get, because he at least ends as an articulate creature.
What about the Robert De Niro version? I haven't seen it. How does it?
Yeah, the Kenneth Branagh one. I haven't seen it, but that is meant to be quite faithful. I think there's a bit more.
It diverges as soon as they start recreating the Bride of Frankenstein, which is not in the book, because the quote unquote love is life. Elizabeth dies, and then he puts the head on the body of Justine. That's nowhere close. Actually, when I come to think of it, I can't really find a reference in the book that the monster is actually constructed from body parts. It's maybe hinted at, but
kind of hinted at, yeah.
The whole Frankensteinian, the way we use it now to say it's a mashup, a stitch-up job, basically stuck together. That doesn't really show in the book. So that's something that comes from this movie version of Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it makes reference to him being made of dead flesh, but maybe not assembled from other people. Oh, Justine, you just roboted it.
It's hinted at.
Do you want to start that again? Sorry.
It's not. Charnel houses are mentioned, cemeteries, body parts, but the sewing together isn't as explicit as I think it's just hinted at.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Before we go on to the next slide, there's a couple of comments from Maria Teresa Nardi, just saying it was a brutal time. Those poets and writers were immersed into a hedonistic view of the life. Pleasure and selfishness was the center of all their doings. Yeah, I mean, that's totally, that's what kind of, that whole clique was completely hedonistic. But I do think that there's little hints of Mary Shelley rejecting that, especially as we'll see. We'll take a look at the differences between the editions, but the older she gets, the more she wanted to kind of tame down those elements of her writing.
You should read the previous comment to that about the vampire.
During that competition, Polidori wrote The Vampire, and Byron, after criticizing him, actually stolen and published as his own work. Yeah, I've read around The Vampire, the story. There's arguments both ways. Some people say that Byron wrote it and that it was stolen by his physician, and some people say it's the other way around. I've got no idea. Again, it's one of those things. Unless there's a document written by one of them, I've got no idea. But I did see both sides of it being mentioned. So let's take a look at how it kind of affected later literature. I've put a couple of images on there. So we've got Poe and H.P. Lovecraft. They're probably going to be, for their image, the two most well-known there. And then you got the Brontes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then bottom right, does anyone want to take a stab? Mm-hmm. We got Bram Stoker.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so obviously this book left a lasting legacy. Gothic literature was getting flooded in the mid to late 1700s. And I don't quite really know how this one stuck out, as there was a glut of it. But it succeeded. I think a lot of it probably had to do with the fact that it was adopted into a stage play as well. But people really took up Frankenstein, and it's left a lasting impact. Obviously, Edgar Allan Poe, I don't really need to go into why the similarities between them. It's the amount of themes, the amount of change in Gothic literature, which we'll cover in a moment, how it influenced the direction was massive. Lovecraft, a more modern version of Gothic literature, but definitely influenced. And Bram Stoker, we kind of mentioned the vampire story. He took that as a massive influence when he wrote it. So let's actually move on to the book. So let's take a look at the characters, do a bit of a deep dive on them, and see if we can pull out any themes by looking at them individually. So does anyone want to start us off on Robert Walton?
Well, the book kind of starts off with Robert Walton's letters to his sister, and Robert Walton is an Arctic explorer that tries to find the thing that all compasses point to, like that, because they don't know how like the Earth's magnetism and stuff works. So they're thinking like there has to be something there we can actually find. And I actually find it quite an interesting way of looking at the book, that it could just be Robert Walton getting scared, not wanting to go on with his journey anymore, and writing the most elaborate letter to his sister about why he had to back out in the end.
That's
Okay.
very implausible, but possible.
Yeah, it's got this. It gets to a stage where you've got 3 levels of narration layered on top of each other, and so you could kind of take that view of it. I don't think that was intended, though.
Letters within letters within letters.
Yeah, I mean, the deepest you get is Frankenstein's monster telling his story to Frankenstein, who is then relaying his story to Walton, who is then writing it in a letter to his sister. So, I mean, it's a bit of a game of Chinese whispers, but yeah, I don't think it was intended to just be his excuse.
There's
Walton-
actually one step more. He's also describing the peasants that he meets.
Oh,
And
that's
he's
true.
describing
Yeah.
their lives to Frankenstein, who's describing it to Walton, who is writing it down for his sister. So,
Yeah.
one
And
more.
then he overhears
It's a
the
lot of- it's a
peasants
lot of
describing
backstories
their
to create.
situation.
Yeah, so you get 4 levels deep. It's a bit of Frankception.
Oh yeah, because you've got the Turk as well, don't you? You've got
Yeah.
that level of story.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, actually.
Walton was the first one who reports seeing the monster. We beheld figure, on a it's a sled or something he's on, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I think he's getting pulled by a sled.
Who's kind of the first mystery that we encounter, followed by Dr. Frankenstein.
So Walton's motivation to go up north is to become famous. That's also what he mentions in his letters. And at the same time, he's looking for somebody who has the same interests as himself, because he finds himself in a world where he is intellectually alone. And so he describes that he meets some people, and they're kind of nice, but at some point he meets this figure which they rescued from the ice, and that turns out to be Victor Frankenstein, and he's really enamored with this person. He really wants to, he really identifies with him. And this goes all the way to the end of the book, where there's this point where the ship they're on is enclosed by ice. And the sailors are basically demanding that he go back to London, but he wants to press on. And he has this choice to make. And Frankenstein is the scientist who keeps on pressing on, and that leads to ruin. And he realizes that, so he turns back to London, saving all the sailors and not going for the glory that Frankenstein initially wants. So in this case, Walton is a bit of a counterpoint to Victor Frankenstein.
Yeah. So I mean, the biggest element of Walton is his use as a counterpart to Victor Frankenstein, where he's still got this romantic notion of valor and of discovery of on his trips to the North Pole. Is it the North Pole? Or
No, it's North Pole.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
North Pole.
Yeah.
yeah. He's still got a romantic vision of his life, basically, and upon encountering Frankenstein, I think that kind of changes from romantic to quite a tragic vision, and that's why he decides to turn back and kind of has a bit of an existential crisis.
He also seems to be the one major character, or not arguably major character in the book, that actually learns something and changes throughout the course of the book. In that, at the beginning, he was all piss and vinegar to go and find the North Pole, but by the end of the book, he realizes that discretion is the better part of valor, and he can't condemn all of the men to death in search of that.
He gets worried, doesn't he, that they'll mutiny and trick him overboard or do something.
When did the Franklin expedition fail so tragically? Anyone?
What's that, sorry?
The Franklin expedition?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with it, yeah.
It wound up with everybody dying, and their bodies were discovered much later, frozen in the ice. I've seen photographs. I'm not sure if it's
1845 that they departed England.
Right.
So that's a good 25 years after the first publication of the book.
So that would have been what might have, what could have happened to them.
That in all probability, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, just as he's the counterpart, let's move on to Frankenstein himself. I think the best. Yeah, I think the best way to get any further info from Robert Walton is also to compare him to Frankenstein. So let's dig into both of them. I didn't realize, but his name actually means. This probably has no relevance, but his name means the Stone of the Franks.
Yes.
So I mean, she didn't choose it for no reason, but I do wonder what that's meant to be hinting at, if anything.
Well, arguably, it could be a commentary on the natural conclusion of the Frankish Revolution. In I mean, that would be a charitable interpretation of it.
By the Frankish Revolution, do you mean the French Revolution?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair. That could well be the case. I've just had a look on one of my notes. Robert Walton's ship was actually called the Archangel. The Archangel, which again is just the amount of religious symbology in it is something we can dig into in a moment. And on that note, Victor also makes reference to always having the angel of destruction hovering around him in life. Can we go into his character? What do you think of his character? Do you sympathize with him?
He gets increasingly more irritating.
Yeah, I know growing up, when I read this when I was much younger, and I had a much more favorable view of Victor Frankenstein than I do now. He gets to the point of being comically melodramatic.
He's hysterical, basically.
Yeah. I mean, on multiple occasions, he either like passes out or faints or fits out of hysteria, and he never does anything to change the situation.
And he just makes so many wrong decisions, like just. When even when he's his wife to be is threatened, he doesn't seem to take the kind of precautions you would assume if you knew that someone was coming for you.
Sorry, I've just seen a comment that's a really good point. The Stone of the Franks is the creation of the man from stone. So there's also an anti-Semitic angle, though. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but the more interesting and the comment on the man of stone. Would be a hint at golems from the past, the men of stone that were brought to life. Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. That's something I hadn't even considered.
It also echoes Prometheus.
And Prometheus. Yeah, that's a really good angle. Sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
Well, I was just going to say that Frankenstein commits to things and then reverses his commitment at basically the worst possible time.
Yes.
He's also just focused on the thing without thinking about anything, any possible things surrounding it. You know what I mean? Like he's purely focused on bringing something to life, but he doesn't appear to think about anything else around it. It's just that.
It's also remarkable that as soon as he brings the creature to life and then runs off, he doesn't seem to ever think about its welfare, he gets sick and he goes through all this stuff. There's never a question about what it's doing, what happened to it.
Well, he's
he
clearly
shuts the door. He shuts the door and leaves, doesn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, he's clearly
Goes
one
for a
of the
walk.
most self-centered characters in literature I've ever read.
Yeah. And when there's the trial of his like the maid or whatever she was, his efforts to exonerate her basically consist of nothing. I think he goes and talks to her at one point, and then I think he just takes a stand saying she's a good person. I can't really remember, but he could have at least made some effort to say, by the way, there is possibly this other killer loose, just in case you're interested.
Yeah, he does make reference to. It does make reference, though, doesn't it, to not wanting to tell people because they'll just think he's mad.
But you think he could have just done something, just something.
Yeah.
That does echo one of the points I wanted to bring up, in that there are only two characters in the book who ever actually see the monster, Victor and Robert. And
who don't immediately die.
well, yes, but one can argue that it's possible that the monster wasn't the one that killed them when they do die. So, because none of them actually die on screen, as it were, they were only killed in retrospect.
There's the people who see him in the monster's retelling of his short life. There's those people, but then obviously the monster's telling you it. So
yeah, there's no further evidence of it outside of the monster himself. Yeah, I mean, that is certainly a way to read it, is that the monster is a manifestation of Frankenstein as opposed to an actual creature.
On the ship, did the other sailors see the creature? Because there's a bit where the creature's going. Well, at that point they didn't even know it's the creature, the monster. Mm-hmm. They just see like a giant figure on a sled zoom by in the distance.
Yeah,
and I think that's sort of the closest you get to anyone else seeing him.
Yes.
Yeah,
and when I saw that, when I first read that, I didn't I thought that was the monster, but I thought that the book was intentionally being vague, such that it could have been, like an Inuit or something, just a normal person up in the Arctic.
Sasquatch.
I think ultimately for the story, it doesn't actually matter, because either way he is a manifestation. Whether or not he's an actual living creature or he is purely in his mind, he is the manifestation of his creation. He is his creation, and their interaction still works. I think it's interesting to look at it either way, but ultimately their relationship doesn't change that much. It's still his creation. It's still his rejection of his creation.
And on that note, Fulwer pointed out the Philosopher's Stone, and it brings up the transition that Frankenstein made from alchemy to science, and that the birth of the monster was an unholy mixing of the two practices.
Yeah, so I've got the names of the people that he studied earlier in the book. Is Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, who is, I think he's heavily involved with the concept of the Philosopher's Stone, and Paracelsus.
For you people in America, that's the Sorcerer's Stone. It's this perversion of science. It's this viewing of the occult, which then twists his mind going down the line of how he interprets science and his the abomination he creates out of it. I think that with the book, it touches on a lot of heavy themes, and it unfortunately for me, it only goes in by an inch. It doesn't push as much as I think it could do. It goes a bit lofty, but doesn't really go anywhere with it. It's a bit melodramatic, but not much payoff. It's still a worth a read, but it's just could go further.
Oh, it was written by a very young girl at the time.
She was how old? 20 at the time, or 21 or something?
Oh no, when she wrote it, she would have been 18, I think.
Oh, was she really even teen?
Yeah, there was a quote
pretty good for an 18-year-old.
by Yeah, I mean, it's better than anything I've ever done, and I'm not 18. But there was a quote by Guillermo del Toro, and he called it the quintessential teenage book, and I think he's right about that. I think it works as a reading it as a teen, where you do go a bit more melodramatic with things. It might be a bit more impactful, but now reading it and looking back, some of that. Not quite as punchy.
The characters lack they either have very big faults which are really obvious, but nobody has any subtle character flaws. They're like for example, Victor Frankenstein is a genius who knows how to combine everything, and it almost goes into fan fiction territory sometimes. Like, okay, you kind of have to distill. It might be because he's talking about himself, but you basically have to see, well, okay, this guy's an introvert and he likes studying books and he's not really great on interaction. He maybe has one or two real friends, and the people he really knows are kind of his family. Also, the girl he's supposed to marry is basically his family.
Speaking of the girl he wants to marry, Elizabeth, completely two-dimensional character.
That's an overstatement, actually. I think
one dimension.
Well, I don't know where you found that second dimension.
I know. As you point out, it's Victor describing her, which makes it even worse because his interest for her is so little that she's just like this figure who's there, who says nice things sometimes.
Yeah, I think that I almost think that was done intentionally in some ways because she is so. All she is there to be this emotional woman, basically. There is literally nothing more to her. And so,
I was gonna say, for me, it made it kind of feel like he didn't he's supposed to have this connection with her or whatever, and he's supposed to marry her, but it makes it feel like he didn't really care all that much about her, like maybe because he doesn't describe her that much or talk about that much. I don't know. You just feel like if you were this attached to someone and you were traveling the world, you'd be a bit more involved.
But he's self-centered. He doesn't. I don't think he cares.
And a lot of the characterization of the relationship is not mentioned in the book, so it's open to the reader to interpret. It's possible there was depth, but it was never elaborated on in the book, so you can draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, well, let's move on to, unless anyone has anything else to say about Victor, we'll move on to Henry. But if you carry on, Justine.
I just wanted to touch on, when we were talking about the writing, you've probably heard the piece of advice for fiction writers, show, don't tell. This, basically instead of saying a thing, for example, saying something is beautiful, show that it's beautiful, describe it. So one thing she does a lot is say words that she's interested in, like the sublime, right? Sublime, which is a really important concept in this book. The awe that something inspires in you. But she just says it's sublime, repeats it a lot. Like, this was sublime, that was sublime, the other thing was sublime.
Yeah. Well, like you say, it is almost like a teenage girl wrote it and didn't fully understand the concepts. But I think that does lend itself to her being the author as opposed to Percy Shelley, because I think he probably had a little bit of a better understanding. And
she's a teenager, but she has been through quite a bit by the point.
Yeah.
She's been through more than most people now would have gone through by the time they were 18.
Yes, and she's far more educated than a lot of other people would have been. And her father wrote Gothic literature as well, so she would have been familiar with the themes.
And the language used is extremely flowery and difficult. There's tons of adjectives and adverbs and difficult language that made it very difficult, very challenging for me, at least, when I was reading through it.
Yeah, I think that show don't tell point is interesting as well, because the setting, the environment, the nature as it's described, it does really well to invoke a lot of emotion, and I think that's where that to me is where it does its best, is not actually in the character interaction. It's when they're alone and they only have their inner thoughts, but there's also the description of the outside world. I think that the confrontation, sometimes it's just so overblown, and it's just hints at things without fully going into it, like you say.
Yeah, it's like an iceberg where, on the tip of the iceberg, you have the word sublime.
That's a good comparison. Before we go on to Henry, just a couple of comments that I'll read. It was a melodramatic age. This is full skip with. And a lot of fiction from the era hasn't aged well according to our sensibilities. Yeah, I totally agree with that. You've always got to bear in mind the time it was written. But even still, I don't think it... I think even for the time, if you read other literature, like take Jane Austen, there was actually... I'm trying to remember the name of the book. Jane Austen released almost a parody of Gothic literature in 1818. And you compare the two of those, and even though it's a parody, it goes deep into more depth on the general themes than sometimes you find in Frankenstein. Sorry, carry on.
I thought about her a lot as well. She makes a great counterpoint because she was so sort of sensible, but then like aware of these romantic ideas that I think she actually found kind of threatening and laughable and dangerous.
Yeah, well, that's
right?
always the best
like
thing with Jane Austen, is like the wry smile that you can read everything with. Like, there's always a little bit of a hint of like, don't take this. Let's push this a little bit further and don't take it too seriously. And I think that works with something like Gothic when you've got these, when some of the stuff is so woe is me. And Maria,
it's very, very emo, very emo.
Yeah, well, you can understand why goth is used as a term for teenagers that want to be noticed by painting their fingernails black. Nature is not sensible. Those stories represent the dark side of nature. Yeah, and I think that goes into the sublime, which we'll cover in a little bit. Right, who wants to mention anything for Henry?
He's another counterpoint to Frankenstein, where Frankenstein is really self-centered and melodramatic. Henry is basically the happy, outgoing person who at one point wants to go to India to do stuff. And when he visits Frankenstein in Ingolstadt, they also go on trips and go out walking. While without him, Frankenstein would just be inside of his apartment, which also is his laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he's good at making, he's good at making acquaintances and friends and business partners, and he just seems to be able to function well in general. Whereas
Henry is an idealized man. He's basically the perfect, or at least in the context of the book.
There's a lot of things Frankenstein.
He's a Superman.
Another one.
He's like a kind of a normal guy, isn't he? He's just like, he's a lot more down to earth than Frankenstein anyway.
It's only because I struggled so much at not writing Henry Cavill, and that's on that title headline. And I think Brandy had a bit of a back and forth with it.
every time I read that, I think of Superman.
Yeah, I think he's just there's not really much remarkable about him. He is just kind of this everyday man, but it's just
I don't know. I'd say there is a significant amount remarkable about him in that he's always the character to whom Victor aspires. He represents what Victor wants, but is unable to attain. He has success at pretty much everything at which he does, and he creates positive relationships with everyone. While Victor seems to alienate himself.
He's there as a counterpoint. I mean, to sort of
That's true, but I kind of, the way I read it is more that Frankenstein is so inept that I mean, Henry, to anyone else, if you just came across him, he'd just be this regular guy. But Victor almost idolizes him for his accomplishments. But his accomplishments are being able to go out and speak to people. Like there's actually not much. There's nothing wrong with him, but there's actually not much significant about his character if you take it from an outside perspective. It's only when we're looking at it through Victor's eyes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, his main achievement is putting up with Victor, isn't it? Most of the time, he seems to like him.
He sort of nurses him back to health, doesn't he?
Yeah.
At the start.
He's,
I mean,
he's just
if it wasn't
Henry
for
Nice
him
guy.
just coming through town and seeing Victor like just crazily going around, he was just like Victor was just like on this weird state, where he's just wandering around town, no idea what's going on after he's let this monster loose, or not let it loose, but created it, and Henry just happens to see him there and sort of rescues him.
It would be good to see a book written through the perspective of Henry. Like,
that'd be good.
Yet again, I've had to look after Victor.
I had to go all the way to Ingolstadt. He's been
in my house for 2 months. He's in my bed.
It's like he's walking behind him with his proverbial fainting couch just to catch him. Like every time he has some kind of doom, like collapses.
Finally, he went on his own in Scotland, and I have some time to do my own business and not mind him constantly.
Yeah.
No, but actually, the reason why he goes to Ingolstadt is because Victor basically ignores his family for like a year or something, for a long time while he's working on the monster. So the moment he created the monster, and he flees his apartment because he's afraid of it. As soon as he sees the monster, Henry jumps off the stagecoach and says, "Oh, look, there you are, Victor. I just came all the way from Geneva looking for you. Like another biggest coincidence in the world." And then he basically cheers Victor up. The monster has disappeared, and basically Victor kind of forgets about all his troubles while Henry is around. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what story from Henry's point of view is, that what letters would look like, and and also that the relationship, the thing that Victor aspires from Henry which is full social acceptance, because he is the ideal social man. It's also what the monster actually wants. He also wants to be socially accepted, but he is also rejected in some way. And I guess that Victor also always keeps some distance to other people. That's the kind of the way he's written.
Yeah, there's a lot of contrivances in this book, and you can get away with that. It's used in a lot of this kind of literature because the bigger themes are more important. They're kind of establishing situations, but it doesn't actually matter the actions in the story. It's the bigger meaning that have the importance. It's like calling Pilgrim's Progress contrived. It's not. Yeah, it doesn't need to be realistic because that's not the intention of the story. But I mean, this, I don't think it goes far enough either way to go full on Paradise Lost, or to actually try and have a realistic scenario. So some of the situations are just come across a little bit ridiculous. Right, let's look at Elizabeth next. I know that the bloke you mentioned some of the changes in the edition in the 1831 edition compared to the 1818 edition.
Yeah.
Should we touch on the change of Elizabeth?
Because I read the later edition, and she's described as basically just some the parents of Victor find her as a young girl, sort of attached to another family. She's been orphaned, and she's sort of amongst almost like peasants, but she sticks out clearly to them as like a noble, some sort of nobility. It's immediately apparent to them that she's, her eyes are clear, as if they can see that she is capable of intelligence and the people surrounding her are not. And so they rescue her, whisk her off away, and then they have their own kids, and Victor kind of grows up with her as her kind of sort of brother, but also she's promised him from a very early age as like his future wife. This is your wife's sister. But
yeah, she's just gifted.
Yeah.
Like,
but the other edition, which I didn't read, but there were notes in the back of mine describing it. I'm sure someone who read it better, read it will be able to describe it better. But she's like just a distant cousin, or no, was it a first cousin?
It's a first cousin, yeah.
Yeah, a first cousin who essentially after that point it's the same. She was promised to him to be married, and so for some reason she moved in with them and grew up with him. And it's quite a different story, and it's an odd change to go from like, I don't know if it was a kind of, she felt it was a bit too incesty or something, which I didn't think at the time it wasn't regarded as such. So I don't really understand why she decided it was very important to go and change the origin of Elizabeth to be.
When you say at the time, it still isn't by law.
Yeah. We looked at
first cousin marriage.
You can still marry your first cousin in the UK, as far as I can tell in the law.
Yeah, and in about half the states in the United States as well.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yep.
That's the reason why Shelbyville split from Springfield in The Simpsons.
I think we may not have changed it in the UK due to our connections with India and things.
Yeah, there's certain demographic changes that really would not like to see those laws changed because it's something like 90% of arranged marriages in I think it's Pakistani groups are with first cousins.
May I say that Helena Bonham Carter is nowadays in everything?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. When I was looking up the images, I went onto IMDb and I was like, "Who's going to play this? Who's going to play this?" And I was like, "This is going to be her. No one else is going to play her. It's going to be Helena Bonham Carter."
she looks a bit different in that picture.
Younger, I think the word is looking. What you're looking
Yeah. Well, I was going to say she's got squarer with age, I think.
Square
Face
away.
just looks like a big cube.
Be nice.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the introduction of Elizabeth as a character was how Shelley wrote the motivations of Victor's parents, in that Victor's wife was the driving force in basically interacting with the world, and she swooped down into the gutter and picked Elizabeth out of there from, ostensibly people whom she was trying to help, but there was no real time spent in the book describing the actual help provided to the poor and destitute by Elizabeth or Frankenstein's father. Just that, they were charitable people, and look how charitable they were in that they rescued this poor noble from living a life of destitution and poverty amongst the rabble.
You mean that the nobles were noble because they were noble?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, you could go down the route of it's all being it's all being said by Victor Frankenstein, so maybe they didn't actually help him and they just stole the child. Like,
Guess that she has a natural nobility about her. Is what it's meant to be.
There's a few mentions of class being quite inherent. Obviously, with Elizabeth in the 31 edition, with her being taken because she's just noticeably different from the other children because of her class difference. There's also mention when he is in Ireland of the rudeness of their class, and like basically they're just a bunch of rabble in Ireland is the general conclusion of that whole chapter.
Was Clerval in Ireland, or was he taken there by the monster?
The book describes that a boat landed there, and that's why they suspected that Victor was the murderer, because he came with a similar boat. So it could be that basically the monster dropped it off at a really convenient point.
Yeah.
And given the fact that the monster has been given a superior intellect to man, I would not put it past him. But
it's amazing that he managed to predict where he would arrive in order to frame him. I'm assuming that was somehow intentional. Or it made it sound like it.
Don't know. Doesn't it just happens? It just happens that This is way later in the book, after Victor angers the monster because he refuses to make a mate, and he basically flees on a ship, and then he gets into a storm. He doesn't have a compass, and he thinks he lands in England, and then immediately insults the native Irish by calling them Englishmen. And then they immediately accuse him of murder.
True in the 1700s, true in 2020. Do not turn up on an Irish shore and call them English.
Yeah, it's basically a road trip movie, but then in slow motion. But he lands there, and they immediately he says, well, he tries to be friendly, and then he insults them, and then they throw him in jail because they think he's the murderer. And it's basically has to be bailed out by his father, and because he has an alibi. But it's all again really convenient that this all happens like that. So
there's some with the nurse as well. There's more, like, there's quite a bit of duty in the book, like ideas of duty, and the nurse is another one of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of her embracing her duty, even though she doesn't like Victor at all. She's still compelled to treat him to the best that she can. Right, let's get to the juicy stuff.
Right. Well, Victor has no duty towards the being.
Yeah, on the note of duty.
Mm-hmm.
What do we think of Frankenstein's monster, or the being? I think it's going to be easier just to refer to him as that. He doesn't have a name, and obviously that is quite a large aspect of the book. Is him trying to find his identity, being cast aside by his own creator. There's a lot of back and forth in the middle of the book when he first has a proper conversation with Victor. And I think it's probably the best part of the book in my eyes, that conversation that they have when he's talking about wanting to have a female made for him. Their back and forth and the reasonings behind why he thinks he needs a partner and why Frankenstein thinks that it's a terrible idea. That conversation is the best part of the book, I think.
Yeah. Well, if he's to be sort of banished from human civilization, at the very least, he can have a partner that can make that, bearable.
Well, yes, but obviously the conflict comes from, is it going to be that the being and the newly created partner for the being do go off and live in this peaceful happiness, or when she's created, you have no idea what she's going to end up coming out like? Is she actually going to accept him? Is she going to be filled with the same kind of anger as he is? It's impossible to know. And
if they can reproduce what have you unleashed upon the world, these two superhuman beings that can basically create a new species.
Mm-hmm. If they can breed.
Victor doesn't actually, think about any of the consequences while he's doing anything, apart from when it comes to this one issue of making the monster happy. Like he doesn't seem to think about anything until that point, does he? It's the only point in the book where he thinks, oh well, she might not like him, or she might be really bad, worse than him, or it's the only point in the book where he kind of thinks about the consequences of the things that he's going to do.
Well, Victor and the monster seem to share the same inability to look ahead to consequences of their actions.
Apart from when it comes to the monster's, bride, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, you have the monster when he relates how he after he was created, what happens to him, and he basically starts out as a blank slate. So he just observes nature and he observes fire, and then he starts observing humans, and he's basically just sponging up information about what's happening around him, and he reads his books, and with him, he's really good at learning stuff. And you could say, well, if he's created from body parts, that those are remnants from his old life or from his old brain, but he's really good at learning languages, and it's also stated that he does it faster than the Oriental girl, Safi. But so in essence, he's kind of a blank slate, and he only becomes like evil or bad because he's ostracized by everybody who sees him. It's one of his traits is that everybody who sees him immediately rejects him, even his creator. And that causes him to conclude, well, if he can't be like an angel and can't be good, then he must be evil. So he starts identifying himself with the devil as it is, and he becomes the personal horror of Victor Frankenstein in that respect, following him around as a shadow. And he's also described as a shadow at some point.
Yes.
Yes, and I think it's said that it's only through his interactions with other people that's how he is, but it's never actually fully said. So I do think this kind of blank slate, nature versus nurture conversation is had in the book, but it doesn't ever. They hint towards the social aspects, which going back to obviously the inspirations that she has through her father and through Percy Shelley, you can understand why it's hinted that way, but it's never actually fully stated. And also the biggest connection it has to Paradise Lost is in this section where he makes multiple references where he's referring to himself as being more sympathetic with Satan. He compares himself to a serpent. That's why this dialogue I think is got the most meat in it.
But like Adam, he wants a mate.
Yes, yeah, and obviously he gets dejected from that. So yet again, it's another reason for him to hate his maker. And I do also think it's an interesting part. I mean, this is kind of getting to the end of the book, but I do want to mention it. This conflict of creator versus creation. So much of the being's life is about finding his meaning, and in this, just as in Paradise Lost, ultimately they find meaning in having conflict with their creator. And obviously we see that play out most in Frankenstein, with at the very end Victor Frankenstein dying and the beast, or the being, having no reason to live anymore, and kind of taking that as his cue to either go off and kill himself or to spend the rest of his life out in isolation.
Well, one of the things that struck me about the monster specifically was the strong, logical, and extremely erudite what's the term? Linguistic ability. He's very capable of communicating. He's very
eloquent.
Thank you. That's the word for which I was looking. His eloquence, and at the same time, a prerequisite for such eloquence is some sort of a logical mind, as evidenced by his observations, and then the emotional response that tends to drive his actual actions are incongruous. He approaches things from a detached, emotional, observational perspective, especially with relating to the quote unquote peasants he observed in the cottage, the cottagers, I believe is his term. And yet the emotional response and the reaction is completely disproportionate. And that is echoed throughout his relationship with Victor, in that every time he's rejected, despite having been, proven over time to observe that Victor is not going to help him, is not going to do what he asks, he responds with violence and destruction, with the expectation that that's going to change things, when it never actually does. And as we learn later on in the book, this is damaging to his emotional core, and he dislikes doing this violence anyway. So I don't understand why the character would continue in this regard, or in this fashion over and over again, when his logical mind which is clearly advanced, would identify the pattern and should act to stop it.
But I was going to say, he's still got the emotion, the emotional capacity of like a toddler or something, doesn't he? He's not. He might be articulate and be able to think things out, but like when he's thinking of how he's going to introduce himself to the blind man and how that's going to go, he knows that how it needs to go, and he knows what he needs to do, but for some reason he doesn't do it. Like, you'd stretch it out, if he'd have been properly thinking about it and paced himself and not rushed in, he probably could have pulled it off, with the blind man.
I'll pop them on screen now. Yeah. I mean, a couple of points on what you've just said. I think that I totally agree with Quackhouse. I think that the way I read it is that he's not had someone to show him how to properly control his emotions. I think that he's the most sympathetic character for his failings because he's not had someone there to guide him. He doesn't excuse everything that he does, and I think that's the issue, is that sometimes it pushes him. It pushes to let him go scot-free for what he does. I think he's sympathetic, much more so than Victor, because Victor just ends up being quite pathetic in some situations. But Victor has been raised in a house environment that is almost idyllic. So this is where I think the discussion between, is it in the social environment or is it nature? It could be argued that why did Victor turn out so weak if he was raised in this environment that was meant to be perfect for him, and then his creation ends up coming out exactly the same way.
And there's the people in the house as well. It describes how, even though things are going badly for them, they're still upbeat and getting on with things. But then in the face of each other, but then in private they'll cry and show sorrow and stuff. But only in private. Like, everything, it's not public, is it? It's not posting your sorrows on Facebook or something. It's
which Victor would.
Which Victor would, yeah, definitely. He'd be like sad face emoji, nothing else.
Yeah.
You okay, hon?
He'd be
getting his black.
Yeah, no, he'd be leaving the comments like, "Oh, don't you hate it when someone ignores your tweet?" Like, he would definitely be looking for sympathy online.
Yeah, he'd definitely be fishing, wouldn't he?
Okay, carry on, Justine.
Sorry, can we say that Victor is 100% the murderer of the people in the book, effectively, or like 80%?
I'd say 100.
Be held responsible. Yeah.
Well, obviously, if he didn't make the monster, then there would be no. Or even if he'd have reacted to the monsters, when it comes alive, if he'd have reacted differently, if he hadn't just done one and shut the door behind him.
Yeah. So sorry, Fulwar. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right. Fulwar Skipwith. This is an aspect of romantic Satanism. She's playing with a popular belief among romantic era Britons that Satan was the hero of Paradise Lost. Yeah, exactly. It's like I say, it's shifting from having a character being empathetic to basically being the protagonist, even though they have no. Well, in this case of Paradise Lost, it's literally Satan that we're discussing. Frankenstein. You can at least Frankenstein's monster. You can at least say that if he was this blank slate, then society made him evil, as opposed to the literal embodiment of evil. That's correct.
Well, but that's actually kind of an interesting note, because considering that he seems to act so much like his creator, that even though he grew up in completely different circumstances, I think someone noted that before, they still turn out so similar in their motivations and everything. So can you really say that he was a blank slate from the start, or was he just shaped by Victor's hand to look like Victor?
That's what I would argue. I wouldn't argue that he was a blank slate. I would say that because he had a creator that had so many failings, that was basically the direct cause of his decline. An imperfect creator makes an imperfect creation.
But the fact is fall from grace as it is due to the fact that society just instantly rejects him from his the way he looks. So if he was exactly the same, but he looked like Henry, for example, then he would have been like king of the town.
Well, that's the
Yes.
implication.
Well, yeah,
I don't know if
We
that's
don't know.
actually going to be proven out or would have been proven out were it written that way.
Yeah. Well, he also kind of reminds. There's this piece in the narrative of the monster where he says like that the society only values people who are either noble born and or rich, and he's neither. So and other people are a slave. So what is he? And this kind of reminds me of the stuff that Gothic, the father of Mary Shelley, wrote. So it's quite a socialist view that you have the noble and the rich, and then you have the wretched poor.
And that echoes, with DeLacy, Felix, and Agatha. We are originally introduced to them as just basic peasants and part of the common rabble, just commoners. But it turns out they're actually former nobles who are engaged in just pursuits of nobility and have valorously sacrificed their wealth in support of a noble cause.
Yeah, there's basically no nobles throughout the story that aren't
Noble.
Yeah, noble. With one exception being the Turk. But was he a merchant? I can't quite remember. I think he was a merchant.
Yes, he was a merchant.
Yeah, so there we go. That would be the get out clause.
In the same section, that the monster's also lamenting his qualities. So he says he has qualities. He's strong. He's able to resist the elements, able to live off the land and things like that. But he said that's not really useful in the acceptance that he seeks. And in that respect, he kind of reminded me remember the movie Gladiator? In the beginning, you have Marcus Aurelius, and then his son comes over and he asks, "What are my virtues?" Because
I have virtues too, Father.
Yeah, it's a very very stoic thing. What basically it's lifted from the memoirs of Marcus Aurelius, and I kind of had to think about that. Like, okay, he turns out like I want to be good, I want to be understood, and he ends up killing his father. So it kind of has that as well.
Yeah,
some similarities.
Yeah, that's a good point. Does anyone want to take the reins on going through Felix and the situation with him and Safi? Okay. Well, so basically, when Frankenstein comes across this family, they indirectly teach him language because Felix, the son of DeLacy, has a Turkish. He's betrothed to a Turkish girl, so they're teaching her language, and by proxy, Frankenstein's monster's learning it.
It's massively convenient, isn't it?
Yeah, another contrived situation. The thing with Felix, and it's touched on earlier in the book. I can't remember the name, but there's a member of the crew of the ship that Walton's on, where they don't just take the romantic notion to the extreme. Like, it falls off the rails of how ridiculous the situations are, where you have a man at the beginning of the story being called noble because he's betrothed to someone who doesn't want to marry him. They want to marry someone of a lower nobility. So he gives them all of his land and then goes and exiles himself from the country. And it's described as being this noble act. But I mean, I don't know if it's done to the point of I don't know if it's done so extreme to be comical or not, but that's definitely how I read it, because I don't care how romantic your notion is.
It's quite possibly the most disgusting thing I read in that entire book.
It's absolutely ridiculous. But similarly with Felix, he sees this Turkish girl, falls for her, and the father basically sells her as a way of using Felix and his family to break him out of prison.
Well, I think the earlier situation is a celebration of love matches, on the part of the the Romantics, right? Like,
yeah, well, I think I think that there's this kind of notion throughout the book in a couple of relationships of fated relationships. Like you could say that Elizabeth and Victor are fated to be together, but every single one of them has this little twist on it that makes it not quite the romantic notion.
And there's Shelley's kind of with the feminism, because with her being a feminist and the reading of it like Islam. That's all connected with that part of the story, isn't it? It's not very favourable to Islam, and it's forced marriages and that kind of thing. But it just so happens that she likes the person that she's been bequeathed to, in the dealings to get him out of prison.
Yeah, that would have been seen as like the extreme example, but there was still quite a vigorous debate in European society about the merits of love matches versus arranged marriages.
Mm-hmm. The wrong side lost that conversation.
Yeah.
No, it's one of those things that reading it now, the notion in England, well, for certain parts of England, of arranged marriages is just like beyond the pale. But obviously, this is still a discussion that's ongoing. In this time,
but for nobility and stuff like that, I mean, for nobility and royalty, it would have been like the norm, wouldn't it? Getting married to, unite houses and countries and stop wars, and it was just the done thing, wasn't it? But this is at the lower levels, it becomes oppression.
Well, I think this is where the romantic notion comes into it. Is that yes, there's a discussion of whether or not they should have arranged marriages, but it always plays out that the people that are arranged to marry are fated to marry anyway. It's never just a marriage for convenience. They always lay eyes upon each other and instantly, it's a match that they always should have been with. So I think that this is used in Frankenstein. But each one of the relationships always has a little bit of a twist on it, like with Felix and Safi, that it is this instant, love for each other, and she escapes to be with him. But that love is then caused the downfall of their house.
But in the setup, he's a noble guy because he does a noble thing, which is how if it had been some kind of nasty munter, it wouldn't have happened, would it? She wouldn't have come.
That's true. That's fair point. Is there anything else we want to say on DeLacy? Actually, we haven't really touched on DeLacy. We touched on Felix. But the one thing I want to say about him is that obviously with him being blind, again, it's this ironic twist that I think that she's done intentionally. He can then be the quote unquote blind justice. He can't. He's not going to be bigoted against his looks and to Frankenstein's monster. That's the only thing that's separating him from human society is his appearance, and we'll never really know if that plays out correctly or not, because obviously Felix and Agatha come home early and come across their interaction, and he's instantly tackled to the ground, and his plans are ruined.
Well, I mean, when I read that, I didn't get the impression that they came home early. I got the impression that the monster tarried, and that's why they were still there. So the implication, or the way that I read it, was that the monster intended to introduce himself to the father, and then depart and allow the father to act as interlocutor, rather than trying to do that all, trying to be there during that discussion.
Yeah, that's it's possible. I think that from the way I read it is that he wanted more than one interaction with DeLacy before he met with the rest of the family.
Well, he certainly laments it later, doesn't he? I don't know whether he knows he's got to work fast in the first meeting. I don't know whether he plans to do it all in one go, but he certainly laments later, doesn't he, how he thinks that he should have just introduced himself a bit more slowly, trickled it out, so to speak.
Yeah, and he's correct on that. Right, okay, so that brings us to the end of most of the main characters. We'll go on to some of the minor characters. We've covered quite a lot of them. The only one that I can think of that, well, actually, the sailors, I think, Freelance, you had an interesting point on.
Yeah, the sailors are they appear in the end of the book. They're basically the group that try to convince Walton to go back because they fear for their lives being trapped in the ice. And Frankenstein, Walton agrees, and Frankenstein then vigorously tries to claim, well, do you guys do not want glory? So he basically wants them to go on and for the discovery, and of course he himself wants to keep pursuing the monster. In the end, the sailors convince Walton to turn back, and that's what they do.
But it is kind of interesting that Victor does make a rousing speech at the end, because before that he is giving a lot of speeches and warnings about the problems with hubris and going beyond what you should be doing.
Yeah, but I think it's also to serve as a counterpoint, to show what Victor's true desire is at this point, which is to keep chasing the monster, and that this thing that Walton is chasing, which is the scientific discovery he craves to become this scientist superstar of his day, that he basically says, well, it's not worth it because I might not return. And that's also what he tells in the letters to his sister, like, okay, I hope that these letters reach you and that I actually survive.
I love the touch of where at the beginning where he meets Frankenstein and he thinks that he's going to be delighted to see them because they'll be saving him from a certain death. And instead he says, like, excuse me, where are you headed to before I get on?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually one of the most endearing parts of Victor. That line alone is one of the few likable parts about him. It at least shows that he's got some kind of courage, that he's basically being given an option to get rest and carry on his journey, but he's so filled with hatred that he can't waste a second by getting on the ship unless they're going in the right direction.
And that echoes the earlier point I suggested about how he commits to the wrong things at the wrong times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, he's also just very obsessed. Like, with his work, he just keeps on working through the night until he's completely, a fragment of his former self. Mm-hmm. And then the same there in the Arctic, he's just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna continue chasing this monster that's like super fast, super strong, and could totally beat me in a fight when I'm like at my healthiest. And he's like, oh yeah, when I'm like starving and half freezing, I still won't take your help because
that's the self-centeredness that is just rampant throughout his character.
Yeah, he's always lamenting that he should have grabbed him while he had the chance, as if he would have won any fight with him. Oh, if I just stepped in then and grabbed him, this would all be over. No, you'd be dead.
Yeah, that was one of the things I wanted to touch on. I think everyone knows someone that after any kind of confrontation will be like, oh, they're lucky they got away that easy. There's a couple of lines of dialogue that really make him come across that way. But the other interesting thing that you mentioned, Lizard, is that he never really finds happiness, and the way he tries to go about it is by getting obsessed with something and putting all of his energy into whether it be creation of the monster or the destruction of the monster. He gets completely enveloped with it and just focuses all his energy on it. But the only times in the book where you actually see any kind of happiness come from Victor is when he is just out in nature doing basically nothing and just his downtime, where he actually gets to switch off. And they're the only times when he actually gets happy, the closest that he gets to happy, because he's always a bit of a stick in the mud. But what else have we got here? Oh, the teachers were quite interesting to cover as well. I think one of the lines, Mary Shelley knows how to turn a phrase quite well, I think, and some of the quotes are noteworthy. This one from one of the teachers, I can't remember which one it was. It was either Walden or Krempe, That's definitely not how you pronounce that. It is the labours of men of genius, however erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. And I thought that was quite an interesting quote that we discussed previously. But what do people think of that?
Probably Waldman, right? Because Krempe dismisses the medievals completely.
Yeah, I think it was Waldman. Do people think it's an accurate quote or not?
Oh, that's certainly accurate. Progress is always made by unreasonable men because they don't accept the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of those classic axioms that is why fundamentally free societies seem to progress faster than those that are chased and chained in servitude.
Yeah, and I also think that that quote is made quite early on in the book, but reading it after you finish it, it could definitely be read as Victor's work, even though it caused him nothing but misery, would be used to advance mankind.
Well, I think it's a condemnation of Victor's work because the rest of the book demonstrates how little comes of his work. So consequently, he is not a brilliant man.
Yeah, I see. He is a genius, though, surely.
But he's an evil.
He's
become like an evil genius, effectively, right?
Is he? I mean,
he's seen by his peers as very.
He's not personally an evil man, or he doesn't have evil intentions. But what he creates is,
I'm still not wholly convinced the monster actually exists.
It's a book, Brandon. It's a book.
none of them exist. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty.
Even within the context of the book,
if he didn't exist,
yeah,
no. In the context of the book, so even if the monster didn't exist, so would the people who actually got killed by the monster, would they be then literally be killed by Victor? Like some kind of American Psycho kind of scenario.
It's really the biggest coincidence in the world.
There's plenty in it already, so I wouldn't put it past it. But
it doesn't feel like it's her intent, the writer's intent, that he's a figment. I think that's too advanced for her kind of ideas.
Yeah, I don't think that's her intent.
That's a fair point.
I'm
probably reading more into it than I should, but that
I'm
doesn't
not saying it's a bad idea.
Interesting.
It does remove the majority of the religious symbology as well, because he's not actually having this struggle with his creation. I like I said previously, I think their relationship doesn't change regardless of whether or not he's real, but a lot of the actual religious elements kind of disappear if he isn't real.
I mean, then you could just make the point that we're all just figments in God's imagination. Like, you could make it more of a religious thing, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You could.
I mean, you can make that argument. I'm not going to buy it.
I mean, I just did, so.
But the thing is, the monster is kind of written as a personal horror to Victor. So, yes. And if you read it like that, then it could be a figment of his imagination, and it goes into this more personal horror thing, where a specter or a ghost is following you, and all these things happen, and other people can't see it. And that's, for most of the story, this happens, and only at the end you see that Walton is actually interacting with it, and even then you could reject it because it's still somebody tells something to somebody who tells something to somebody. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do understand that view, but it doesn't add anything to the story.
But it can take away from the story. I think that's the
problem. I mean, it doesn't have to be just a figment of his imagination to be a projection of himself, right? Because it is a projection of himself, and that he created.
Yeah, it is a part of himself, but it not just a mental construction.
Yeah,
I mean, it could be, but like again, someone's coming exactly the same comment. Maria just says that he's chasing something he sees in himself. So yeah. Regardless of whether or not it's in his mind or not, it is himself that he's actually fighting against. So a lot of these we've already covered, but I just wanted to bring up the themes. The interesting thing I wanted to look at was the classic Gothic themes that were around in the stories prior to the release of Frankenstein, and compare those to what we actually get in Frankenstein, because obviously it's known as one of the most famous Gothic books. It is also a science fiction novel, but it's interesting that there's not really many. When you look at classic Gothic themes, there's not actually many that appear. So these themes were really codified by Horace Walpole in the release of the Castle of, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Otranto in 1764. The main ones that we actually see, obviously the macabre and the morbid is very prominent in Frankenstein. Medievalism, I think the way that she incorporates that is Frankenstein's influence by the occult writers that we have previously, and the people that are involved with alchemy. That's kind of her incorporation of that. There's no real introduction of any kind of Gothic architecture, which we use quite a lot in the literature. She does use a lot of landscape descriptions, but she doesn't really describe many buildings.
But the landscape descriptions is not that uncommon in that era, since this is before we had film. So if you had a book, then you really needed to paint landscapes and
Yeah, exactly.
But it does come across when she's describing like Switzerland or the Lake District or Scotland. Clear that she really likes mountains and just nice countryside, as well as like the building, as well as like the city life.
Yes, yeah. Well, this is the
Oxford
thing.
And things.
She describes it, and they're very nice descriptions. But the way that architecture was used in Gothic literature, tended to be used in Gothic literature, is that the building itself was a representation of the story, or it in some way it reinforced the Gothic literature. So it's like having the sublime inspired by the architecture and the feeling of terror that's caused by those buildings. It incorporates the theme of the Gothic and also the horror of the story. Or things like underground chambers and things like that, where there's a lot of secretive, hidden knowledge in the building itself. She doesn't really do that with any of the landscapes that we have in the book.
No, it's more like I say. It's more like the love of the countryside and the mountains and the hills and things.
Yeah, exactly. Mysterious imagination. So that's kind of covering that. Gothic only really works when you have a concept of the immaterial, which obviously that is a major feature that we have in Frankenstein. And emotional aesthetic. I'm going to butcher the description of this, I imagine, but essentially it's covered what we've covered before with the sublime. It's that reinforcement of the immaterial through sublimity, and terror being used, terror being invoked by the story, not through just fear, but it's more existential than just fear. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
He basically has to admit that he did something wrong, something terrible, and he doesn't want to do that. If he was just afraid, then he would tell everybody about it, like, okay, this monster is coming and it's really strong, and but that's maybe one of Victor's biggest problems, is that he doesn't want to admit his failings to other people.
Yes, yeah.
Because this thing is an extension of himself, and it's horrifying to him.
Yeah.
But also, his failing wouldn't be that he made it or that it looks horrible. His failing is his personal failing, in that he neglected it,
And he's paralyzed
and
by
was scared
his
of it
emotions more than anything else.
Yeah, and again, it's that one step up where it's not just a failing. It's not just one failure. It's literally his entire being is a failure because the creation that he has made in his image, quote unquote, is an absolute abomination. So, on that cheery note, I mean. Do we want to pick into any of them? A lot of them we've already covered. I think the biggest one that's in Frankenstein and is used going forward in a lot of other literature is the hubris of the story. Now, there's multiple quotes I've pulled out relating to the hubris of all characters, really. Walton has it to an extent. Frankenstein, obviously, is filled with hubris. And even his creation... it's more of a with the creation. It's more of a blissful unawareness of the environment until he is first exposed to the hatred that he comes under. Like his interaction with DeLacy, it's less hubris. It's more just childlike wonder.
It's the same with the girl that he rescues from the stream, and then he's immediately punished. So yeah, you can't really blame him from hating society for that.
I mean, he knows. I don't know that it's serious because he knows he's going to get rejected, and he knows what he is, but he hopes, doesn't he? He imagines what He imagines that he could endear himself, but he knows that he knows he can't.
Yeah,
and every time he tries, it's always like it's a total knockback, isn't it?
Yeah.
But again, he doesn't learn from his mistakes, really, just like his creator.
Yeah, he's too much of an optimist. Like, he expects too much, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And he's sorely disappointed each time.
Okay. Hidden knowledge, I think, is quite an interesting one. We've covered it already, but I think this is probably what draws me most to the whole genre. There is something quite enticing about it, fundamentally. That there's not just knowledge that we don't have, but that upon discovery, it does nothing but ruin your life. And I think the more modern writer that incorporates it a little bit more is Lovecraft. That's who I automatically think of when I think of hidden knowledge. That there are these words, these creations that upon discovery you're better to be in ignorant bliss.
Well, it's this biblical theme of curiosity, who should be as gods, knowing good and evil as they do.
Yeah, I suppose it's biting the apple, isn't it? Okay, we just had a comment come in as well. Again, full while skip with. If the primal source of horror is the possibility of a world without God and not a world without God, then the uncertainty of the monster's existence is part of the uncanny aspect of it. I'm just going to reread that.
That would be true if Frankenstein would doubt the existence of the monster, but he knows that it exists. It's not a question for him. He knows it's there. The only time that it becomes doubtful is whether the monster is still chasing him, because at some point he actually expects, well, I've gone all the way to Scotland and I'm on this remote island where like 3.5 fishermen are living, and I rented a cottage, and it's I'm at the end of the world, and then he looks out of the window and the monster is there, and so he's quite certain that monster is there and it's following him.
Yeah, but the rest of the world doesn't echo that.
That is true. So, but he never told them. So
a few times it's only when he starts like lamenting the monster out loud. He'll start shouting, "Oh, this bloody monster's chasing me," and then suddenly the monster will appear, like he summons it.
It's after Elizabeth died and his father died of grief that he starts talking to people.
Right, he consults the magistrate and tells the magistrate, and the magistrate emotionally believes him, but then the rational side of the magistrate takes hold and says, given the givens and given the description that you provided of the monster, I have no chance of possibly doing anything about it. So it's much better for me to treat it as though this is not actually something that exists and move on with my life. And I suggest you do the same.
And then Victor's answer is to start chasing the monster, which I think you skipped one comment from Maria Teresa Nardi, where he's chasing something he sees in himself. The creator becomes the monster due to his hatred, which is, actually in the end he starts hating the monster and he starts chasing it, and that's the final chapter of the book. And this is after he has lost everything, and he's just as isolated as the monster himself, because all his friends and all his family are dead now, and then his only thing he has left is revenge.
I think he still has one surviving brother. Isn't that Ernest?
But he's hardly mentioned, so it doesn't matter.
which is appropriate for his name. He's got a lot of honesty in the novel.
I'm gonna predict something about the future. He's one of the little ones.
Just on the comment of Fulwa that he made there, I think it would be that's true, but it would be more true if it was reversed and the uncertainty was the monster talking about his creation, as opposed to Victor talking about what he has created. It would be the monster talking about the being that created him. But I'm not sure about that. It would work, and it does work as a theme, but I don't think it's fully in this. Okay, so I just wanted to, before we finish off, cover a couple of the critical responses. When it was first released, it was kind of met with mixed response. one of the reviews that I found when they discovered that it was written by Mary Shelley, by the British critic, they said, "The writer of it, we understand, a female. This is an aggressive. This is an aggravation of that which is the prevailing fault of the novel. But if our authoress can forget the gentleness of her sex, it is no reason why we should, and we shall therefore dismiss the novel without further comment."
Wow.
So I just it was when I was doing my research, I came across that comment and I thought I've got to stick that in there. It's an interesting thing that we find though.
Times have changed. Let's say that.
But no, the comment of her being female, obviously not down those lines, but there is something about romance and Gothic themes that tend to draw female authors, and I do wonder what that is. I think there's this kind of interplay with,
like I say, like you were saying before, it's very flowery. It's in the language and just in the I don't know, and in the actions of the people as well.
Yeah, I think there's this contrast between like decay, death, and the beautiful. And love. I don't know if that's the kind of interplay there that draws them or not, but.
You're going to wonder if a guy had written it, like, would there have been fisticuffs, at some point between Victor and the monster, or, at no point there's any kind of, there's no fact, there's not a single, there's not a single punch thrown in the whole thing, is there? I don't think, it's.
Yeah, I believe all of the violence takes place off stage, as it were.
Yeah. Well, except for one of Victor's brothers, because that's retold by the monster. There's a bit of strangulation, and that's about it.
Yeah, and there's the bit where the guy in the house throws him off or throws him to the ground or whatever, but it's not, it's more of a defensive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the most violent section is I was struck with a stick or something to that effect.
Justine, what were you going to say, sorry?
Victor needs a weapon, like a rocket launcher or something,
Well, he shot at one point. He shot in the shoulder.
That's true. He does get shot.
Right. Yeah. So there's a little bit of parental guidance there.
No, I wonder if what is it about the interplay between? What is it about the interplay between Gothic themes and romance that draws women? I mean, look at it now. That obviously it's a far cry from what it was, but look at like Twilight and things like that. They are almost.
Is it just like a way to do romance plus?
Well, it's as far as I can tell, at least from reading this novel, I'm not terribly immersed in Gothic in general, but it would seem to me that the emotion is what drives the story, and everything is suffused with emotion. Whereas in other genres, there are other drivers of the story,
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that comes from it being an offshoot of the Romantic movement. Maybe that's kind of where they get that, because it is very much emotions above all else. It's kind of a rejection of rationality. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, aside from reading that quote from the British critic, the other critic that I thought worth mentioning comes from a unexpected source, Germaine Greer. She criticized it, and I think it's actually a very valid criticism, and it's something very difficult that unless you're a very skilled writer, I think it's very hard to avoid. She basically commented on the fact that throughout the book, the narrative voice is exactly the same for every single character. Now, that could work for the voice of Frankenstein and the monster, but Walter sounds exactly the same as them as well. Just to look at the book that we're going to be covering next week, when you take something like Lord of the Flies, when you're reading the lines, you know who's reading it. They have different character, they have different voice, not just in their accent through the way it's written, but you know that certain lines and certain phrases are only going to be spun by one character as opposed to another. Whereas in this, you take any line of dialogue and it could be a quote from any single person, because they all speak with the same voice. None of it comes from the character. You can tell it all just comes from the author, and I do think it's a fair criticism.
Well, on the other hand, everything is in letters from Walton, so you could say that.
Yeah, no, that's completely true as well.
But even then, it's
But it's someone reading someone else's letters about someone else, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. But I think the critique is also valid because it kind of hinders the novel a bit. So, so in story, explanation is valid. Okay, there's one writer, but if it would help if they had a more distinct voice, if indeed the lines of dialogue were not, or the lines of thought, because it's mostly people thinking to themselves, were not interchangeable. And that would, because the result is that we end up with saying, well, the monster is basically the same as Victor, but but a slight difference in circumstance. And that's also why we start even seeing between Henry Clerval and Victor Frankenstein, we start to see parallels, because they're all described in the same way and they all have the same kind of words around them. So yeah, it would probably help. Would probably be a slightly easier read if they had more distinct lines.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like you say, there is a get out clause by using the framework of it all coming through letters, but if you're having to use that as a defense of a critique of the whole piece, then I don't think it's a good comeback, really.
It's just Henry. Walton. He's paraphrasing everybody, using his own language.
And they also make mention that Walton's notes were edited and reviewed by Victor. So.
Yeah, and some of it is written directly from letters that he has on him, if I remember correctly, as well.
Yes.
So you think the letters that Victor has from Elizabeth, he wouldn't need to put it in his own writing, because he could just transcribe
that is very true. Yeah, and from his father as well. He receives a letter from his father.
Yeah,
and I would expect that his father would have a very different, at least a different style, not exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Given that his father has a very different character.
Actually, whilst we're on this, it's a little bit of an offshoot, but should we discuss the like everyone seems to speak like a universal language. he does when Victor lands on the shores of Ireland, he does make comment. He's like, "Oh, you speak English. It must be in England." But wherever he goes, he seems to be able to communicate with everyone. That includes Victor and the being. Obviously, he learns that language through which way around is it? He's in German. Sorry, is he in Germany and then he learns French?
Yes.
Yes, that's correct.
It's near Ingolstadt.
Yes, yeah.
Ingolstadt.
But Victor just seems to be omnipresent.
It is mentioned. It mentioned way in like letter number 4. So that's before chapter 1, in the introduction, that he speaks English with an accent.
Mm.
So and it would not. It would be imaginable that he in his education would have learned at least 3 languages. So there would be. And he's from Switzerland. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be multilingual a little bit, I'm sure.
So I would understand, being Swiss, that he also would be able to speak German, and probably he learned English on the side, given the fact that he's also really smart. So
yeah,
Henry seems to be able to speak both English and French at least, which is, given the kind of person he is, also not at odd. So yeah, but on the other hand, it's like they do seem to have some kind of universal translator with him, because there's like he's able to understand the Irish. So
he found a Babel's fish on the shores of Scotland.
And you have to take into account that back then there wasn't really that much. There wasn't television, so people would tend to speak more dialect. So that would also be kind of a hindrance. So imagine going to Scotland.
It needs to be mentioned that most of the places where Frankenstein goes throughout his travels are places to which he's been invited by someone prior to his arrival. So it's reasonable to expect that the individuals with whom he's going to be directly interacting would speak at least a common language.
No, that's true. That is true. Where does he assemble the crew? I can't remember. Where does Victor assemble? Where does Walter assemble his crew?
I think that's in St. Petersburg.
I think that's right. That sounds right.
Or was it? Well, he started up in St. Petersburg. Maybe it was a town he hit after that. But somewhere around there.
Yeah, well, language-wise, it's not going to be better, because at some point people start speaking Finnish.
Yeah.
Well, it's also to be considered that it's explicitly a port town. And a port town on the butt end of nowhere. So one would expect there to be at least some sort of common trade language that permeates it.
Okay. That was a bit of a rabbit hole to fall down, but I found it interesting. Last thing to look at before we finish off, I just wanted to bring up Percy Shelley's review of the book that he probably had a hand in creating.
That's very Marilyn Manson like.
Patting himself on the back for a few paragraphs.
Yes. Now it says it's released in 1832. It was, but it was released after his death. I think he died in 1820, somewhere around there. But I just found it. I found it interesting. The 2 things I found interesting about it were. The main thing he seems to pull out of it was the idea that evil is found through the environment as opposed to being inherent in the creature. So obviously you can see for him that was the biggest theme that he pulled out. And I think that he's got a real unconstrained concept of human nature. So it would be what he picks out. But I do think there's arguments both ways. The other thing that I found funny was how much he bigs himself up, or bigs her up. There's a section, one of the most original and complete productions of the age. I just think if you're married to the person releasing this, you don't need to blow that much smoke. I think it's better off not to release this kind of stuff. I just thought it'd be a funny thing to finish off on. So, have we got any final words before we finish off?
I don't recall us touching on this, but it's important. I think it's important to the structure of the story and the relationship of the characters to mention that when in the final culmination of the book, the monster kills Elizabeth. Frankenstein is terrified that he is the one who is going to be killed, and it doesn't enter into his mind at all that the monster intends to harm his bride.
Yeah, that's his self-centeredness, which comes up.
And even though it's killed everybody around him. Right?
Yes.
By killing the people he loves.
Yeah, despite the repeated admonitions and threats to that effect made by the monster throughout the entire rest of the book, the ultimate conclusion is, oh, he's going to kill me on my wedding night.
Well, that was that quote, the fake quote someone posted where, the monster says, I'm going to kill that which you love the most, and so he immediately thinks it's himself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I say, the more the book went on, the more I found Frankenstein just annoying, like just an annoying emo.
Repugnant.
But would everyone recommend that people read it, or what do you think?
Absolutely.
Was it worth the read? Yeah.
I think in terms of the history of ideas, it's very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and especially from just the amount that it's used and references in other things, it's worth the read. I mean, I found it more of a slog than the last book we did, but it was still good, obviously, but it just wasn't as enjoyable as Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, I think that background reading on it was probably more interesting than the book itself, and just seeing its influences. I think it's definitely worth reading, and it has got some. It's not. It can be difficult to read, I think, unless you really put your mind to it. I think is the other thing. So obviously, some of the language is quite flowery.
No, it was more just I don't know whether it's just because the character of Frankenstein just annoyed me so much. I
Yeah. I agree.
I'm gonna break with the panel and suggest that you can pass this. I'd recommend Paradise Lost before I'd recommend this.
Yes.
There's probably better books to recommend, but I do think that it's worth it purely just on a sort of I don't know, just sort of historical note, like you said,
Yeah, and it probably was ahead of its time in its subject and really. But yeah.
No, I agree. I think that there are books that tackle the themes better, like Paradise Lost. There's films that you could watch to get a general gist of the story, like Young Frankenstein. But yeah, to fully appreciate the influence it's had, which it has been. When you think of a teenage girl writing this on a little orgy trip out in Switzerland, I highly doubt that in her mind, 200 years down the line, she thought that people would be sat about still talking about it. But for that alone, I think it's worth looking at.
For me, like the themes of like duty and stuff was probably what I took away from it most.
Mm-hmm.
Just
or lack thereof.
The lack of, but then when it was there, displayed by some other characters like his father and the people in the house and when it was there, it was pretty obvious, and it was also obvious when it wasn't there.
He's a deadbeat dad whose son becomes a delinquent.
Literally
bolted so fast.
Okay, so let's finish up on that note. So,
the original deadbeat dad.
Yeah. A little bit of a change to the schedule. It won't usually be weekly, but we have the book that we've covered previously. We are going to be doing another stream next week, same time, 5 p.m. GMT. Next Sunday is going to be Lord of the Flies. I hope people have enjoyed it. If you have any other recommendations, just drop us a comment just to say what you'd like us to include on the reading list. And if there's anyone with any other final comments, but if not, then we'll call it a day.
Like and subscribe, and click the bell and all that shit, and share us on all your networks.
And join us for special items behind the scenes.
Please ignore all of the shilling. Right. Goodbye, everyone.
Smash the like button.
Bye, my